In this video, we are going to discuss help-seeking and domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors and how librarians fit into this equation. This video is informed by two different studies. One was conducted in Texas with in-depth interviews with survivors, shelter staff, shelter directors, and police officers. And the second was conducted in UK, and it was comprised of 31 women survivors who were interviewed twice over 5 months. So we're going to take a look at how crisis impacts help seeking and information seeking, and this is for anyone in crisis, not just domestic violence and sexual assault. Creates heightened stress, and it impacts focus, priorities, and perspectives. Which can influence which information channels are perceived as potentially helpful. So for this, if an abuser is using the police as a scare tactic, or saying that the police aren't going to believe them, or that they're going to take their children away from them, that fear is going to impact who they seek information from. They're not likely to go to the police. The abuse cycle also shapes cognitive, affective, and behavior interactions. So in Lynn Westbrook's study, she discusses 6 areas of information needs, and we're going to go through individually and talk about each information need and some of the questions that survivors and victims may have about those and the information that they may be seeking. So the first stage is initial consideration of a life change. So this is before they are even possibly aware of abuse. So they're looking for information on abuse. What is abuse? Am I being abused? You know, the honeymoon phase of the cycle of abuse, so having a power and control wheel out, things like that. So really just defining what abuse means in our community and to our legal community as well. They're looking for information on shelter and its service information, so when they start to recognize that they are being abused or that it's not a safe environment and are turning their attention towards how to get out of that, shelter is a big part of that. So how long is a shelter going to house them for? Will it help them find another home after that? Is it going to provide the basic necessities they need to leave? It's going to help them get a job, education, things like that. With the police, they need to know how to work with them. So what questions to ask them, finding out what's possible as an outcome. Is it going to go to court? Is it even possible to charge the abuser? And how to follow up with different procedures, because we have civil versus criminal court as well. And they're also going to need information about money, so they need to have clear and explicit information about who can help them with a variety of issues, such as, paying for childcare, paying their bills if they have filed bankruptcy and they don't qualify for certain federal funding. How do they navigate that? How do they navigate having bad credit? Because all of these things may be a direct result of their abuse. They may have had an abuser who really tanked their credit score, and now they're worried about being able to find housing when they flee. The second stage is during shelter and or a criminal justice engagement. They need information on the benefits that governments pay, essentially, for victims who are fleeing. And there are certain qualifications for this. Sometimes it needs to be something that was filed with the police in order for the funds to be given to someone. And I will make sure that I link this information about New Hampshire's specific benefit information with this video. They also have concerns about their children. So how do they help their child deal with the trauma that they witnessed? Where do they find affordable daycare for their child so that they can go and try and find a job or go and try and find housing? They may want to relocate out of the state, which is where benefits from the government can really come in handy. So what are some other shelters in our state, or even out of state? Do we partner with anyone out of state to relocate them? They may need transportation information, specifically how to stay safe while they're going from place to place. The bus route may not be the safest way if their abuser knows they take the bus and is going to look out for them at the typical stops. A taxi might not be safe because the abuser works for a taxi company, things like that. So how to stay safe when you are going about the city and moving around. And one thing that was mentioned in this study was that which bus route to take to get to a service that's recommended was really wanted by survivors. They really appreciated that people were providing them information about where to go, but they needed to know how to get there. And by not listing, even just a simple like take bus A, that they had to go through extra work to then access those resources. So if it's as simple as adding on a bus route to your information or your service that you're recommending, survivors have stated through this study that that was a barrier that they were welcome to have be fixed. They also need medical care information, so where can they go to address their physical health, their mental health, and possible substance abuse care that they may need, because substance abuse is often used as a way to cope with the trauma, and so they may be seeking to get off of substances when they flee, they may not. So that is another kind of layer of this, where if you do have a patron who appears to be under the influence or on drugs, not jumping to conclusions, it may be a side effect of trauma. The third stage is post-shelter, post-police planning. So this is, what's going to happen after I leave shelter, what's going to happen after I'm done with this police case. So they need housing information, which is always evolving and changing. Different programs have different numbers of people they can fit, and people are leaving, and when is there going to be an open bed, things like that. And some survivors may want all of the information up front about all of the possibilities for housing, and others may need to seek emotional support before beginning that process to kind of process what it's going to be like to have to retell their story multiple times to different agencies, because unfortunately the agencies do not necessarily talk to each other, and so victims are often trying to find the courage to retell their story to a bunch of different people who they probably have never met before, just to find the basic necessity of housing. They also need information about jobs, and not just one type of job, but a variety of jobs, because different victims and survivors are going to have different needs. So they may be fully capable of becoming a full-time permanent worker right away, or they may just need a temporary day labor job where they're able to go and work enough to get a security deposit on a home or an apartment, and then they need to take some time off to take care of themselves. And then there are others who may need in-home employment options because they have children and they can't find daycare for them, or they can't afford daycare for them while they go and work. They also need education information, and this was discussed a lot in Lynn Westbrook's study, that while a victim or a survivor may not have even completed high school, they maybe only passed the 7th or 8th grade, but they wanted to become a teacher, they didn't want people just telling them, okay, well, you need to go get your GED and then we'll talk about it. They really wanted to know the full step-by-step plan of how they needed to get there so that they could make a decision with all of the information. And then they also need information about the basics. So where do they find clothing, furniture, housewares that are within their budget, or even possibly free or through government funding, so that they can furnish these new homes that they're going to have to move into when they move out of the shelter. The fourth is legal concerns in making a life change. So these are issues around child custody, support, and visitation information, and abusers will often use children in criminal and civil cases as kind of leverage or threatening to take them away. So being prepared that that is something that may happen in court can really help a victim be more aware of that as a manipulation tactic. And they also will need information on where to find lawyers that are affordable. They'll need information about court and police procedures. So Lynn Westbrook is great at breaking things down. So she broke this down into 3 different categories. So effectively, they have a fear of the unknown, a fear of facing the abuser in court, fear of making a mistake in the courtroom because it is such a highly structured area, and oftentimes there is a repetitive behavior within the abuser and victim relationship where they're expected to be a certain way all of the time, and that fear can translate into the courtroom because it's a place where not only the abuser is, but there are other people high in power. And they also may have a fear of being manipulated by the court system, and that may be a fear that the abuser placed within them, or just a fear of ongoing cycle of abuse and not trusting the court system if it hasn't pulled through for them before. Say they've called the police on the abuser and nothing happened with that, they may have a fear of being manipulated by the court system again. Cognitively, they need information from the legal or criminal justice domain to determine what the police can and cannot do for them. So for this, it's kind of, if someone is to get charged with domestic violence, what exactly do they have to have done to get charged with that? And what is a realistic expectation of a sentencing for that? And behaviorally, they are much less likely to return to the abuser if a court and police procedures are completed effectively. So if the outcome is what the victim wanted and is changing the pattern or the cycle of abuse, then behaviorally they are less likely to return to the abuser, which is the ultimate goal if that is the victim's goal. They also need information about child protective services. It's often used as a threat by abusers. Children are used a lot when if it is a relationship where there are children, children are often used by the abuser as a manipulation tactic or threats. So accurate information about when child protective services actually can step in, what would qualify them to take children out of a home, things like that can really help ease a victim's mind. They need information about criminal procedures, whether that's for an immediate reason or if they're just planning and so they want to be aware about what that procedure is going to look like. They need information about filing and dropping charges, protective orders, emergency protective orders, and filling out reports. And I'd like to add in here that these are not necessarily services that librarians are providing. No one expects a librarian to also be trained in the same information that a crisis center worker would have, but being aware of the unique information needs and the help-seeking behaviors of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors will allow you to be aware of what resources they are looking for so that you can have the information about those resources ready to go if someone comes in and says they need them. So they also need information about divorce and property. So sometimes they're unable to find jobs immediately. They might have difficulty locating the funds for an attorney. And this is if they are getting separated and, assets may be frozen. They may not have any, things like that. They also need information about how exactly to document the abuse that they're experiencing and where to keep that, because keeping documentation can be dangerous, but there is a way to do that safely. So how do they document their abuse and stay safe without putting themselves in danger? And how do they keep information about their children without losing that? So the other thing that they need is documents information. So like basic documents that everyone has, their birth certificate, driver's license, legal identification, immunization records, things like that. How do they go about obtaining those? Because chances are they either fled and didn't have time to grab those, although the crisis center does encourage them to keep a bag packed with those items before they actually flee. So when they're in the process of planning to flee, that is something that is discussed, but not every time that someone flees is they are not necessarily working with a crisis center, nor do they necessarily have the time to pack a bag. It may be a very dangerous situation where they just have to leave. So how do they go about finding these documents again? What agencies do they need to go to? Things like that. And then the last two about legal concerns, they may have their own criminal record, and that may be a direct result of the abuse. It may not, but they will probably need information about how to clear their record so that they can help find housing and jobs. And then they also need protection from the abuser. So how do they stay safe through a variety of routes, at their job, at their home, when they're out in the community, things like that. The fifth section talks about immigration-related information needs. So abuse happens outside and within the U.S., and sometimes people in our community have experienced it inside and outside the U.S., and they may be involved with multiple different levels of the legal system and social services. So being aware of that. They may have immigration or residency information needs. So sometimes the abuse fear is overwhelmed by deportation fear. So really finding concrete information about what would require someone to get deported so that someone who is being abused but fears deportation can make a decision with all of the information about whether or not to report. And then they also just need some basic information, so basic concept of abuse as being illegal in the United States, the services that we have available like crisis centers and police departments and sexual assault nurse examiners, and then providing these in the appropriate language for the person who is seeking them. And then the last thing that's discussed is that there is an overlap with all of these information needs. So someone does not walk through these step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are likely in all categories. They may be in 2 of them at the same time, 3 of them at the same time. And so being aware that there are multiple moving factors within a victim or survivor's life where they may need information. So in identifying barriers in help seeking, we turn to Evans and Fetter's study from the UK. And while this happened in the UK, I do believe that these transfer almost equally to the United States. They're not anything that is overly unique, at least in my experience from working with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. So the study states that victims often fail to recognize the abuse as abuse, so that is why there's a barrier in seeking help. They don't know that they need to, or that they may want to seek help. The disclosures of abuse rarely led to direct or immediate contact with proper service agencies. So when they interviewed these women, they had discussed how they had disclosed, but they weren't given information for any services. So this is another reason why having librarians who are aware of this information, who are out in the community sharing this information, can really help benefit victims and survivors get in touch with the resources they need. Past relationship experience can also impact their barriers in help seeking. So when you are the victim of abuse, it makes you statistically more likely to be a victim again. So past relationship experience may mean that they come from a generational systemic abuse pattern, oftentimes called intergenerational violence, or it may be something related to they have children with this person, and so those relationship experiences impact their help seeking. They may have fear of repercussion from disclosure, whether that is fear from police, family, friends, or the abuser. So every time someone discloses, it is a safety risk for them in case the abuser finds out and then takes that information back to the victim and continues to manipulate and abuse. Informal disclosures to informal networks. And this is the most important thing from Evans and Fetter's study. Informal disclosures to informal networks, such as the library, were only successful if the person who heard the disclosure knew about resources available in the community. So this is why it's so important that we know what crisis centers are in our county and that we know which police departments have jurisdiction there, because if we overhear a disclosure or someone partially discloses to us and they need this information, we need to be able to get it to them right then and there, because that is how they are going to be successful in making decisions for their life and preparing to either flee or try to work on making it better or whatever their decision is. But they were only successful if the person who heard it had the resources available and knew about them. So what can libraries do? We can ensure that staff members are aware of the resources available in the community, and this LibGuide is one way to do so. You can also discuss ways to partner or collaborate with organizations in your community like the local crisis center or the police department or any other agencies within your community who would be interested in doing work with victims and survivors, so that you as librarians can have the most current information, but you can also be in the community promoting healthy relationships free from abuse and position the library as a place where information can be found and as a helpful help-seeking service. And also, I just threw this in at the end to be aware of the ways in which abusers may utilize the library to manipulate or threaten the victim. So while most libraries have policies about husbands and wives, they may have separate cards, things like that. But I know that oftentimes we make exceptions for those rules. So being aware that by making an exception to a rule, say the victim has a library card and the abuser comes in and they're married and the abuser is trying to see what materials they have checked out, and they say, oh, I'm so sorry, we can't find the books and I just need to know what books we have. Well, if the victim is trying to subtly check out books with information about domestic violence or sexual assault and abuse and trying to kind of work through their own process of identifying that they may need to flee or change their situation, then it's going to directly cause harm to them. So just being aware of the ways that this may impact your services that you provide, and when we kind of cut those corners to make exceptions for people that we think are not causing harm but very well they could, and there's no way for us to know that. So I've included in here the references, which is the 2 studies done by Lynn Westbrook and Evans and Fetter. So please check those out. They're also linked on the references page. And as I stated before, I will link on this video underneath it in the text box. I will link the resource for federal funding for victims in New Hampshire who are looking to flee.